This is a series showing that coffee was sitting inside the systems that made the American Revolution possible. Trade, taxes, supply chains, public conversation, consumer resistance, and ultimately, American identity. Welcome to Brewing the Revolution.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Brewing the Revolution, where tea represented the system and coffee became the alternative, and ultimately part of our American identity. I'm Dawn Kennedy, CEO of Convoy Road Coffee Roasters, and I'm here to talk to you in episode 3 about the division of the colonies after the Boston Tea Party. So we know from the last episode that in 1773, the colonists resisted the British tea tax, as well as some of the other broader issues that it represented, by dumping $1.7 million worth of tea in the Boston harbor. And when they did that, the first thing we need to realize is the colonies at this point were not United States. They were colonies and they were under British rule. And the first thing I want to say is that that act of destruction of the tea in the Boston Tea Party was not universally hailed as a good idea. It really did divide the colonies. There were people who thought that's so brave and let's resist. And then there were people who were like, are you insane? What is the king going to do to us next? And so it became a little bit of a hot point within the colonies before the British responded. And when the British did respond, they actually escalated the colonial crisis. So I again have my notes so I get the dates correct for you. And if I get them incorrect, please drop it in the comments. I am not a historian. I am just a nerd for history. And I just want to try to keep this as clean as I can. So in 1774, in response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament decided to punish Massachusetts. So they started with a series of the coercive acts and then the intolerable acts. And basically, the first thing they did was they closed Boston Harbor. Now, if you remember, in Charleston, they had seized the tea. They were still resisting the importation of the tea, but they didn't destroy it. They decided that Boston was the bigger problem, so they closed Boston Harbor until the colonies paid back $1.7 million worth of destroyed tea. That wasn't going to happen, but that's what they did. Then the Massachusetts Government Acts, it changed some colonial governance. First of all, it gave immunity, and the Administration of Justice Act actually protected royal officials from any sort of local prosecution. Didn't really matter what they did to the colonists. They were not going to be able to be prosecuted within Massachusetts. And then there was the Quartering Act, which basically says you have to take our British troops into your living room and feed them and house them. And I promise you, the Massachusetts colonists were just not happy about this at all. And it's interesting, in 1774, the same year of the coercive acts and the intolerable acts, there is a letter from John Adams to his wife, Abigail. And John Adams, this was written in 1774. He wrote Abigail Adams from Falmouth, Massachusetts, after riding about 35 miles out of Boston. There was an innkeeper there. There was a boarding house woman, and her name was Mrs. Houston. And he was inquiring of the boarding house keeper, Mrs. Houston, whether a weary traveler may refresh himself with tea if it has been honestly smuggled or paid no duties. So that was not a question about avoiding the tax. That wasn't even a financial question. That was an ethical question. If tea that was smuggled or duty-free was even available. And Mrs. Houston says that in their boarding house and in their area of Massachusetts, they have renounced all tea in this place, but I can make you coffee instead. And John Adams wrote to his wife that he had drunk coffee every afternoon since that day, and he believed that, quote, tea must be universally renounced, unquote. So this is a letter, an actual archival letter from John Adams in 1774 that is taking the stance that tea had become politically contaminated. tea was not going to be something that you could just select without maybe some judgment behind it. Loyalists drank tea, it was suspicious. Patriots drank coffee, and they should be watched. And, maybe they're being a little seditious. And in the September and October of 1774, after John Adams had made that declaration in this letter, it's interesting. They, went to the First Continental Congress. We know that was before the Revolution. We were now sort of in the messy middle between the Boston Tea Party and Lexington and Concord. And it was messy. People were really divided. And the 13 colonies got together in that First Continental Congress just to sort of figure out, well, what could a unified resistance look like? So in Charleston, they seized the cargo, but in Boston, they closed our harbor. What could it look like if we all came together and said, we don't want this system anymore? So they adopted the Continental Association on October 20th of 1774, and they were asking for agreements between the colonies for non-importation and non-consumption of British goods, and then also non-exportation agreements from things like the tobacco and the cotton back to Britain. And in that case, there was an organized boycott. It was an actual organized political action and resistance. And it basically shaped what the consumers could buy or sell or serve or, consume, and what their decisions reflected in the marketplace sort of became part of that resistance. It's very interesting that the merchants at the time really kept two sets of books. They knew which households, you know, still bought tea and which households still bought coffee. It really became something that we could tell by your table in the morning which side you believed. Loyalists didn't completely go away, but they were seen as a little bit suspect, in that not that they were drinking the tea, but they were okay with the system that tea represented, the taxation without representation, the quartering of the soldiers, the closing of the Boston Harbor. So they were actually seen as the colonists who believed that what they were living under was perfectly fine. And that became a problem, as we know. Lexington and Concord was then in April of 1775. Again, before the Declaration was penned, we were starting to fight. And, the war really began before our political identity was fully finished. But coffee was a big part of that early American and patriotic identity, because by what you drank, people could tell basically what you politically supported. I'll see you on the next episode of Brewing the Revolution. We're talking about coffee going to war and how it shaped the American Revolution. And there are some pretty cool anecdotes in the archives that refer to coffee. And when I started the deep dive on this series, I was blown away at the amount of times that coffee is referred to in personal letters and things around the American Revolution. And it really deserves a moment to think about the daily ritual that you have was first shaped by people who wanted to change a system. So if this helped you think about your coffee a little bit different today, that was the whole point. I always forget to ask you to subscribe, like, and share. So I'm doing that now so I don't get in trouble by the editors. And I'll talk to you next time, episode 4 of Brewing the Revolution. Thanks so much.